She'd take several moments out of her day to sit in her bathroom, right in the direct beam of the sun that cast itself through her window. She'd warm herself in the yellow glow of the sun and embrace it like she would her mother, with love and tolerance. She needed that sun, needed that light, knowing it was one of the only things left keeping her sane. It was rule number 6 after all. Keep yourself sane. She couldn't afford to lose herself to it. Not before she discovered exactly what the hell had happened to her peaceful little town. It was this she pondered over nearly every day and night since this whole thing even started. And it was what she pondered now as she made her way into her simple little kitchen. She passed by the rusty stove, the cobweb-filled kitchen sink, the dust-covered countertops. She passed all of these, except the kitchen table, a table that held a small basket of what most ponies in Ponyville nowadays considered to be worth the value of diamonds. Apples. Sweet, delicious, life-prolonging apples. The only thing left that wasn't poison or struck down by some kind of weird disease. It was because of these diseases that rule number 5 even existed, which said to only eat apples. Twilight picked through the bushel for the healthiest looking one. A dark red gala apple, and held it in her hoof. She gave it a long, hard stare, taking a moment to peer around every square inch of the delicate morsel before taking a quiet bite from it. She let out a grateful sigh through her snout as the juicy goodness made its way down her throat, her mind filled with gracious prayers that the apples were still delicious. She didn't know exactly how, but despite what had happened, it seemed Sweet Apple Acres was still in business, regardless of Big Macintosh's absence, and the fact that the entirety of the farm was mostly outdoors. How Applejack was collecting these apples and staying alive, she hadn't the faintest idea. Her work was to be commended, though, thought Twilight. She hoped that when all this pain, bloodshed, and chaos was over, that maybe she could get Applejack some kind of medal or special trophy for her brave deeds to equestrian kind. Maybe even a statue in her honor. She was sure that the country mayor would appreciate that. Twilight smiled as she took down the last of the juicy apple, turning and heading back towards the main area of the library. It was just about pitch black around the area, with the only saving grace being that the moonlight from the full moon up in the sky helped illuminate some of the cracks between the boarded up windows. She trotted towards the window to the left of her heavy boarded up front door and peeked through one of the cracks, letting her eyes trail over the house just across the street. It was a small, two-story house, built and shaped just like all the other houses of Ponyville, and boarded up just as heavily, too. She felt a slight pang of sadness, but comfort in her heart, knowing that Spike was resting just beyond the barriers of that house. He was lucky enough to have gotten inside with Carrot Top and Big Macintosh, even Rarity of all ponies, when the event started. She'd known when he was there, watching the library and looking for her. For at 2 p.m. every afternoon, the white slip of paper would slip through the boarded cracks. It was their little signal that let the other know that they were watching. And then another slip of paper fell through. It meant they were leaving the window. It made Spike and Twilight feel better, sitting at their windows and looking over towards one another. Hope is what kept the two smiling. That even though the small street cut them off from one another, they were still alive, and they still loved each other. She smiled, staring over towards the darkened windows, wondering if her little Spike was having good dreams instead of the nightmares that plagued her every night. Just as she began to wonder what kind of dream he was having, a dark shadow flew past the front of her window, making her leap back and fall on her flank. She pressed her hoof firmly against her mouth, cutting off the gasp that had nearly escaped her. She should have expected it, she told herself. She knew that the streets were usually empty at night, and that the ones outside were drawn to houses with the lights turned on. The lights some pony forgot to turn off in their hurry to flee Ponyville before the quarantine. They loved the light, of course, which is why Twilight knew the houses with the lights turned on were so dangerous. She even knew that many of the ponies left alive knew what she knew. They knew the rules. They knew not to go outside. They knew not to trust the empty streets and not to venture out at night just because what was lurking outside was afraid of the dark. Notes were traded back and forth across the basket system, warning ponies about the night. Notes written with frantic scrawl about the fact that even though the ones looking outside were afraid of the dark, if they saw any pony outside, they'd move in for the kill. Move into the night regardless of their fear or not. Twilight sighed, remembering those who chose to ignore these warnings, remembering the frantic screams of those trapped outside during the night, the screams that only signaled more and more of those outside to go on the hunt. She took a moment to breathe, quietly moving away from the window and out of its view range. She didn't want to chance it looking inside and seeing her. If it saw her, it might be a good 2 or 3 dives before it eventually forgot she was there. And it was those days she couldn't afford to spare. Every day and a half, the basket system would send her a fresh supply of apples. And with such high demand of the apple market these days, no pony could afford to go hungry for long. If there was ever a sudden shortage, one could easily start suffering from the effects of starvation. their animalistic instincts driving them to go out in search of food, to go outside. With this in mind, Twilight moved to one of the bookcases, her eye squinting at a bookmark lodged in between two books. She pulled out the book to the right of the bookmark and looked over its title, quietly reading the words, "The Equestrian Guide to Gardening and Garden Gnomes." Looks like she was learning about gardening today. She smiled and made her way towards the closet door nearby. A tiny sign hanging from the doorknob that read, "Happy Place." She opened it quietly, stepping inside the closet and shutting it gently behind her. It was a fairly cramped space, but roomy enough to seat a small pillow, a lamp, and a small basket that held 4 apples inside of it. With careful movements, Twilight pushed the pillow against the bottom crack of the door, and with the careful movement of her teeth, turned the knob on the lantern to the right. The soft yellow glow of light began to gleam from behind the glass, hurting Twilight's eyes at first. They adjusted after a few moments, allowing her to at least get a good look at her book. If she ran out of air because of the pillow plugging up the door crack, she'd just turn off her lantern and go out into the main room for a while. It was a pretty simple process, and it at least kept her mind on other things than what lied just beyond her boarded-up door. It was more or less an escape from all the wretched evil that seemed to plague her town. A practice which she had made up into a list of all the things she required to herself to do daily. Something to keep her mind focused and her mental status sane. A few things to keep her from asking herself the same question over and over and over again. What happened to Ponyville? A routine. End of chapter 1.